LCSC students of African history. Professor Eric Martin here. And in this video, which I hope is short, I want to give us the rundown of what we're going to do for the rest of the semester, just some reminders. And then I want to talk a little bit about what y'all did last week with the Bowen book, and that'll probably be enough. So let's start with just kind of going through what we got going on for the rest of the semester. It should all be squared away in the course modules and all that kind of stuff. So flipping through here, this week, week 12, we're finishing up our discussion of the Bowen book. We're talking about the operation of the colonial system and the colonial impact this week. I got a little bit more to say about this later on. Next week, you will watch a video on Tuesday, Basil Davidson video looking at the rise of nationalism, and your book analysis. Not a book report, book analysis using the criteria that we've been discussing in the discussion boards is due on the 18th. Now this part here, don't forget we got a book for next week. Don't let it sneak up on you. What am I talking about? Talking about nervous conditions, okay? And so on Tuesday the 23rd, got another discussion of the final video from Basil Davidson, and then discussing nervous conditions. All right, and that's the video setting it up. And then we get to the final week, week 15, and it's easy enough with one twist. Your promised map quiz, and it says Tuesday. It's really due by the end of the day, Thursday. I'll change that. And the formal essay. Map quiz. Map quiz is straightforward. It's countries of Africa. Okay? You're going to click on this quiz when you're ready, and it is going to give you a map of Africa with a number of countries colored in with like some kind of code on them, A, B, or C, and then drop down menus, right? Pick the correct country. You get one shot at it. It's on a 10-minute timer. I'm not asking you to use a proctor. Just get this taken care of. We've talked about it since the beginning of the year. I've told you this was coming, this was coming, this was coming. Here it is. And so it's open now. You can take it today if you want. But you have to have it done by the end of the day on May 2nd. And then you also need, by the end of the day on May 2nd, your formal essay to be submitted, which is to include an additional outside reading. And I have only heard from a few of y'all in terms of which one you're using. Don't forget about that. All right. And with that, that gets us to the end of the semester. So if you guys have any questions about that, send me something through the inbox. Now, let's talk about the Bowen book a little bit. Some of what y'all wrote was pretty good, and some of what y'all wrote needs a little bit of being addressed here. So let's just talk about the format a little bit. For the most part, I'm really happy with what y'all wrote. Some of y'all, the first 2 or 3 people that get in on the author's purpose, awesome. That's great. But we shouldn't have more people telling us what the author's purpose is than we have people telling us what the chapter's about, right? That wasn't so much the case for chapter 1, but chapter 2, it seemed like we didn't have a whole lot of people go into the details with the chapter. Um, but let me just cover a few of the things that y'all may or may not have got. I'm not going to go through this in, fantastic detail, but I'm going to go through a little bit just in case there's a few things that you think you might have missed. The whole point of the book is that when this particular book was published, and I'm digging out a publication date because I didn't sort it off on the top of my head, 87. Older, but reprinted early 2000s because it's important. And his argument at the time is there hasn't been a subject in terms of African history that has been written on more widely than the colonial period. But he didn't think anybody had written about it from the perspective of Africans. And so, well, let me back up. He didn't think that it had been, the literature that had been written had been well discussed. So he wants to bring that to the highlight. This is a synthetic work, and part of his work that he's doing here is connecting the dots with all the other material that's available out there. And I think you should keep in mind that is kind of his point about this. Oh, don't know if I have to. You guys give me 1 sec. There we go. That is part of his point. Part of his point is I know that some of y'all were, kind of overwhelmed by it. Seemed like he's just listing off names and listing off dates and listing off events and listing off books. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is he's listing off all this scholarship and all these details that people say they can't find. And he's saying, yeah, well, have you looked here? And that's the important part about this, right? The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is the author. And somebody, I'm not going to dig it out because I can't remember, but somebody brought up the idea about, being a little bit concerned that he was a politician. And so you have this politician writing history. It's actually the other way around. It's the historian particularly interested in the colonial period of African history who winds up getting into politics. And he's an interesting character, and he's actually interviewed in some of those Bowen pieces. So let's talk about chapter 1 for a second. And you guys did a pretty good job looking at chapter 1. But the deal about chapter 1, right, is Bowen is painting a picture of pre-colonial Africa that is on its way to developing a modern nation state, maybe not exactly like the European nation states, but a modern nation state, going through economic changes, going through political changes, going through social changes, and interested in mutually beneficial relationships with Europeans. So I think that that's important to kind of keep in mind, that he is, directly refuting this argument, right? That pre-European contact, pre-European colonialism, that Africa was, completely stagnant and backwards. He's saying, well, that's just not true, right? So it's a little bit of the, not necessarily a counterfactual, but kind of like, okay, well, here is the situation. If Europe had not shown up with a colonial mentality, if that had not occurred, where would Africa be, right? And so he goes through some of the economic changes. He talks a little bit about some of the economic changes that occur as a result of the abolishment of the slave trade. He talks about how that there was more peace and stability because there was no need for raids. There was a wider distribution of wealth. You began to see population growth. You began to see more integration of African markets and African businessmen into the capitalistic world, and that Africa was producing commodities, not having a human being as a commodity, right? So there is a commercial unification that occurs within Africa. And he talks specifically that during the just on the eve of colonialism, right? So, 19th century, there's basically three African economic systems. One based out of the Mediterranean and kind of coming down the Nile. One coming out of the Atlantic and sort of the Niger system, sort of an Atlantic system, a Mediterranean system, and then an Indian Ocean system, right? And he talks about 19th century, these three different systems are starting to overlap and interconnect and commercially integrate, right? So economic growth. Along with the economic growth and the economic centralization, he talks about how roughly 1880, there's a lot of political changes that are occurring on the African continent, and there's greater centralization, right? The states are getting bigger, the states are connecting with one another, and there's an emergence of big kingdoms in Egypt, in Ethiopia, in Madagascar, in Buganda, Bunyoro, that he's basically making the argument that the nation state building process is underway and that there is experiments in political modernization and experiments in constitutional government. And he brings specifically, he goes into a lot of detail about that Fanti Confederation. The issue with the Fanti Confederation, right, again, is he's on the one hand, he brings up a lot of names, a lot of dates, a lot of examples. On the other hand, he is directly combating this attitude, right? It's like, well, you guys said you didn't know any of this. You said it didn't happen. And so he goes into deal. Well, here's the Fanti Confederation, and here's their proposals in terms of how you develop a multi-ethnic state in this region, right? And then he goes through some of the social changes that are occurring within Africa at the time. Increases in population, slower rates of migration within the continent. So you've got some population stability. He talks about some religious changes. Some occurring within Islam, where you have this series of jihads and a spread of strengthening of Islam, that you wind up with more missionaries and missionaries expanding their roles in society, Christian missionaries in particular. And then he talks about this issue that happens with some of the Christian missionaries as converts get westernized, right? And that's going to be part of the story in Nervous Conditions that you guys will be reading. And then he talks a little bit about African intellectuals who are combating racism, right? And so I think that that's a good, that's good enough. Where he's really trying to lay out the idea that like Africans were somehow uninterested in Europe, uninterested in modernization, uninterested in nationalism, unchanging. He said, well, that's just not true. All right. So, gets us to the next chapter. And I love the way Bowen writes, because I'm kind of flipping through my book here as I talk, because he gets into, if you'll look at page 27, well, it's 27 in my version. You may have a different version. But on the first page of chapter 2, the last sentence of the first full paragraph, in this chapter, I intend to. That is a nice, clean thesis statement. And you guys should all be thinking about that for your writing. In this chapter, I intend to examine this rather unexpected turn of events, which has been known in history as the scramble for the partition of Africa, and more importantly, to analyze the initiatives and reactions of the Africans in the face of the sudden forceful occupation of their land and imposition of the colonial system. He lays it out nice and clean. This is what he's going to do. And then he wants to look at, the very first thing he does is like, well, let's take a look at some of the previous explanations for why it happened, right? And he takes a look at Hobson and Lenin. Some of y'all mentioned being interested that Lenin was brought up in this. So Lenin has a couple of different places in history. If you're interested in this kind of thing, he wrote a book called Imperialism, the Last Stage of Capitalism. Gotta have some coffee. That book is worth reading. In terms of getting Lenin's idea about one particular phase of the history of capitalism, roughly 1900. Hobson and Lenin make the argument Europeans looking for areas of investment. Robinson and Gallagher making the argument that imperialism was just an accident of European diplomacy. Hopkins making the argument that the scramble for Africa occurred because of some very specific conditions on the ground. And Asiwaju making the argument that there's a new situation in Europe with the rising Germany, which promoted them to come to Africa. And the point is, Bowen rejects all these, not entirely, but the idea that it was only about economics. He says, look, there's social and political forces that are also important. He reminds us that the scramble for Africa was a worldwide phenomenon. It includes the acquisition of territories in Asia. It includes the acquisition of territories in the western United States. If you look at what's happening in the far west of the U.S., it's the same time frame, it's the same technologies. Manifest Destiny, the civilizing mission, the white man's burden, it's all, more or less the same thing. And he reminds us that, on the one hand, you've got these economic motives, new markets for industrializing Europe, raw materials, and capitalists need to invest surplus money. You've got political reasonings. You've got an exaggerated spirit of nationalism in Europe, and that's gonna, really peak at World War One, sort of. I mean, maybe it really peaks in World War Two, but it hadn't peaked yet in terms of our discussion here. And then also the idea that colonies operate as European status symbols. And then you've got a social situation which goes something like this. As a result of industrialization, many of the industrializing countries in Europe, I'm thinking England and France here, have a problem with a additional workforce with nothing to do. But if you can convince these folks that they can live a life in Uganda that they could never live in London, then the colonies become an important way to move a portion of the European population, kind of operating as a steam release valve. A part of the population that's starting to get a little discontent, right? Because they feel like they deserve more than what they're getting. And okay, well, you could get even more than that in Kenya or South Africa. Um, okay. He talks a little bit about the African responses to the new imperialism. And I think it's pretty interesting the way he divides it up, because he talks about, well, there's not really an African response. There's educated Christian African response. There's educated Muslim African response. And then there's the majority response, which would be sort of, not no formal education, sort of a traditional response. Um, and so it's worth making sure that you understand that, as go back and check that out. As some of y'all have pointed out, he takes great offense to the term collaborator. He thinks that's been thrown around way too easily. um, in this particular case, he sees that when folks are, throwing that term around, they're really sort of describing them as traitors. And he doesn't see it that way. He thinks sometimes it's people operating, for their own interests. And he uses that example of Samora Toure and Emperor Menelik as some of his examples. Oh, let me back up. Got my names confused there. He uses the examples of Sheikh Ahmadah as the example. Those other two names come up when he looks at some of the military responses. And in the end, he really comes to the conclusion, right, that the deciding factor, right? He ends both chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 2, with the same couplet from Hilaire Belloc. I'm not sure. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. And I think that's a nice device where he uses that same couplet, first chapter, second chapter, and kind of sets things up for how things are going to go. So anyway, pretty happy with y'all's discussion. I'd like for you to get into a little bit more detail, all right, as we get into chapters 3 and 4 in terms of the operation of the colonial system. Once folks have kind of already covered, this is what the chapter is going to be, we don't need any more on that. We need details. Pull up an example. Hey, here's the example he uses on page 60 to demonstrate whatever the point is, right? And go into detail with that. For the most part, I'm pretty happy with how things are going. All right. That's 23 minutes of pure YouTube viewing enjoyment for yourself. Let me know if you've got any questions, and enjoy your historical studies.